Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Well, welcome to this week's podcast. We have with us this week a special guest. We have Jules Woodson. Jules, say hello.
Hello.
And for those of you who don't know Jules' story, which I'm assuming probably most, if not all of you do, Jules Woodson is the brave survivor of Andy Savage, who publicly came forward January 5th of this year. And as a result of telling her story, some pretty dramatic changes took place, not just at Highpoint, but I think in a lot of churches across the country. And I think we're seeing some really positive change. Of course, last week was the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. And survivors have come out in just mass numbers, and they're supporting each other and encouraging each other. And I think change is no longer on the horizon. Change is right here. And it's swift change, and it's just powerful change. So I don't know if we just want to jump in and just start asking you some questions here, Jules.
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that we're kind of curious about is what was your tipping point that led you to go public? Because obviously going public, once you do that, once you make that decision, there's no turning back. You've kind of crossed a threshold where you know that your name and your face is out there, and you know that your life is going to change forever. So what was that tipping point that led you to make that decision?
Yeah, so there was actually multiple things that kind of happened cumulatively. But first, I would say a friend of mine, Darcy, who I used to be in the youth group with, contacted me about a year and a half ago, and she had been troubled by what she thought she knew regarding my story. And, here we are years later, and she wanted to reach out to get the truth. And that was the first person who had ever reached out to me in any fashion. So that was very... It was very emotional for me, but it was also a really positive thing, because I finally felt like someone cared enough to make that phone call. So Darcy had reached out to me, and we had talked. And as you and probably many others know, the Me Too movement was really picking up last fall. And as some of the really powerful stories were coming out, it was kind of like a trigger for me and all that I had been through. And then the story about Matt Lauer broke, and that kind of was the icing on the cake for me. I knew that I could no longer handle internally what I've been trying to handle for so many years. And so Matt Lauer was on the front page of the USA Today, and I happened to see that my abuser, Andy Savage, had tweeted about Matt Lauer's situation. And as you can imagine, that was very disturbing. And so I decided on December 1st to email Andy Savage, asking if he remembered the assault. And at that point, that was all I was going to do. I was looking for some acknowledgement. I was looking for some genuine repentance and sorrow for what had happened. And I think, I needed to let him know for my sake how much it had affected me. As I was waiting for a response, I started doing a lot of online research, and I happened across a survivor's story, and it's actually 3 men. Their names are Kenny Stubblefield, Brooks Hansen, and Michael Hansen. And they told their story of being abused by their youth pastor about a year before. And what was really ironic is that when they were going public with their story a year prior, the church where they had been abused was merging with Highpoint Church. And so in one of their testimonies that they shared publicly, Andy Savage's name was mentioned, and they quoted him telling the congregation that nothing sinister is going on here. This is just 2 great churches coming together. And it was seeing my abuser, his name and his words in writing, trying to cover up the story of Kenny, Brooks, and Michael. And that was what lit the match on fire. And at that point,
did those guys know about? Did they know about Andy, or did they not? The survivors who had come forward.
So they knew Andy and Chris Conley, but they did not know who I was or that Andy had abused anyone.
Yeah.
So when I saw their story and their mention of Andy and Andy kind of covering up their stories going public, I immediately contacted them. And at the same time, like, I'm waiting for a response from Andy Savage, and nothing, not even an acknowledgement that he got my email, although I sent it to the email that's posted on the church website. So I knew someone had seen it. It was an active email, and but I got no response. And so it was the no response from Andy Savage, and then finding out that he was really trying to cover up Kenny, Brooks, and Michael's story going public, that really just kind of sent me over the edge. And I thought, I have an obligation to say something at this point.
Yeah.
It's not just about me. It's about potential other victims. It's about doing the right thing. And so that was really kind of the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I've interacted with Kenny some. Kenny Stubblefield, and I'm not sure about the other 2, because everybody kind of blends together after a while, but he's a go-getter. He's feisty and just a genuinely nice guy. And, I think because he is a survivor, he just totally gets it.
Absolutely.
And he's great.
I reached out to him, and ever since then, he's been just an amazing support for me, as a friend, as a fellow survivor, as an advocate. He's a really great person.
Awesome.
Jules, I love what you said when you said about going public, that you finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was you realized you couldn't keep quiet anymore, that this wasn't just about you. And I love you for that. I truly do. It affects so many people when we tell our story. And I just want to thank you from my heart for telling your story.
Well, thank you, Claire. I appreciate
that. Let's see here. Jules, as we're talking here, we're thinking, what was the main thing you hoped to would happen as you went public? That's a huge step to take. And you opened yourself up to all kinds of negativity. You knew that you'd be criticized, judged, put on the carpet, so to speak. You knew that your life wasn't going to be the same, obviously. what was the main goal of you going public? What would you say that was?
Well, I think it all really boils down to accountability. Like I said earlier, I wanted Andy to acknowledge what he had done to me. I wanted Larry Cotton and Steve Bradley to acknowledge how their action, or should I say lack of action, really caused me, trauma, hurt, and has been something that, has affected my entire life. So I think I was looking for just some acknowledgement and like I said, some genuine remorse, hoping that by sharing that even if they, after all this time and all the things that have happened, that they didn't see what they did was wrong. Now I've come out and I've said all the ways that it's affected me. And I was really hoping that there would be empathy there, and just, genuine remorse. And honestly, when I decided to go public with my story, the way I did that was through Dee Parsons of the Wartburg Watch and Amy Smith of Watchkeep. I wrote out my story, and those two amazing advocates and supporter of survivors that agreed to share my story on their blogs. That being said, I thought maybe 100 people would read my story. And I said to myself many times, I said, I know that I'm exposing myself in a very vulnerable way, but if by doing that, I could help just one person, whether they'd been through a similar situation to me and they just felt alone, whatever that might be, that if I could just help one person, then it was worth it to me. Little did I know that my story would wind up making international news.
Yeah, I think more than 100 people were reached.
I think that went national news pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because I remember seeing it. That was, I have a bad sense of time, but if I remember, it was still in January that was national news. I mean, really quickly.
Yeah, you're correct. So the day we published my story on the Wartburg Watch and Watchkeep, that evening, Andy Savage came out with, I don't know what you want to call it, I guess a pseudo confession. There was a lot of minimization, very poor language, but I think what he called it was he admitted to an incident with one of his youth students. Obviously, that was me. And so then a few days later, with that statement that he went out, that he made public that day, he then went before his church and basically made the same statement. And that's when the standing ovation happened. And I think it was a culmination of the admission that it really happened. It was the truth. And the fact that they used a lot of very poor language. One of the things that just was heartbreaking, and it even makes me sick to think about it or much less say it right now, but they said in that Sunday service, they said, we're heartbroken, or something along those lines, that Miss Woodson is not on the same path to healing. And that's just unbelievable, really.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And then the fact that the entire church stood up and gave him a standing ovation and clapped for him. It was very traumatic all over again.
Yeah. Well, I had watched Chris Conley's sermon following the quote unquote confession. And I thought to myself, if Jules is watching this right now, this message, I mean, in my mind, Chris Conley made that message against you clear as day, that you were casting the stone that you are not without sin, you are not without fault. And it was so dramatic with the, opening up the box and pulling an actual rock out. And I was like, this has to be absolutely crushing. It's literally like taking somebody who's been steamrolled, and now you're literally pulling a rock out of a box to say, you caused this to our precious church.
It was,
and that's how I took the message.
Yeah, it was truly horrifying. And that actually was the time when I also found out that Chris Conley had knowledge of my abuse and hired Andy anyways and never reported to the police. I found all that out with the rest of the world that Sunday service.
Wow.
That's horrifying. Jules, you said several times in your talking here, you just wanted to be acknowledged. I think that message needs to get out to the world, how important that is to those who have gone through the horrendous trauma of abuse, just to be acknowledged. Can you elaborate just one or two sentences on that, how vitally important that is? I don't think we can hit on it enough.
Absolutely. And it really kind of ties in with one of the questions that I know you wanted to ask, which was, what were the negative effects that the cover-up had on me?
Yeah.
And the biggest thing is it completely isolated me. Them blaming me, calling it a consensual sin, telling me to not talk about it with others. It was extremely isolating. And when abuse happens in the faith setting, you have a whole nother dynamic that you don't have outside of religion. And that's the spiritual abuse that goes along with it. So I've grown up in the church all my life. I had been attending that church since I was about 5 years old. So my church family was my life. The youth group was my life. These were the people I trusted. It was my everything. And when I reported the abuse the day after to Larry Cotton, who immediately told Steve Bradley. And like I said, as I shared in my story, they asked me if I participated, essentially blaming me for having a part in this, and said that the church would handle it. And it made me believe that it was my fault. And then so many other missteps that were made, such as, not informing the congregation what had truly happened, throwing the going away party for Andy, all of those things pushed me further and further into isolation, into depression. I was consumed with guilt and shame that I now know was not mine. That was not my burden. I should have ever carried or been given for that matter.
What I'm hearing, Jules, is you were minimized. You, as a person, as a member of this family, this church family, as a member of your people, instead of them surrounding you and lifting you up, holding you up during this hard time, you were minimized. Each time they pushed this under the rug, so to speak, it minimized you a bit more. And I think there is shame, horror, and just the worst travesty of all to be found in that. And I appreciate because they refused to acknowledge me and what I might possibly be dealing with, then that gave them room to be accepting towards Andy, my perpetrator, and just continued to minimize me. It allowed the rumors to spread within the church. Just so many
ugly, ugly, ugly things that come along with a cover-up. And honestly, I haven't truly spoken a lot about this, but it sent me into a deep depression, so much so that I had to leave college just a couple years later to seek psychiatric treatment.
I can understand that. I think I deal with grief a lot, in fact, daily. I work with those who are grieving, and as I'm listening to you, you had layer upon layer upon layer of grief. When you have lost, you lost an entire church family. That was your life. And those in the faith community understand what we're talking about. Maybe others won't get it so much, but those were not just little friendships, they were soul friendships.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I know other people have said this, but I'll say it again for the people in the back. The cover-up is sometimes just as bad, if not more traumatic than the actual abuse itself.
Absolutely. I am so thankful you were saying that. So thankful that you're able to be here to say that.
I think what's given me a little bit of a different insight is, being a minister myself, I have kind of a different perspective, or maybe not perspective, but ability to see and hear, kind of a fly on the wall perspective, I guess, of being able to know what church leaders are thinking and, what causes them to do these cover-ups. I had 4 cases come to me just this week of bad cover-ups. One of those I contacted church elders about it and got a condescending email back about basically, I got the sense, mind your own business, bug off, and we've got this covered. And, I think from these leaders' perspective, they really think that they're doing what's right. I really think that Larry Cotton, that Bradley, Steve Bradley, these guys, I really think they thought they were doing what's right. I really do. I don't think that to them it felt like a cover-up, but it's this idea that, the beloved person who's right in front of us couldn't be capable of something so horrible that this person is accusing them of. And abusers prey on that, and they know that other people are thinking that. And so, church leaders make themselves susceptible when they have really bad theology. And, one of the things that churches keep telling me, a lot of them don't like me because I'm all about exposing evil. If evil's there, expose it. Paul tells us to do that in Ephesians 5 and all over the place. Like Paul says, have nothing to do with the deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Like Paul doesn't beat around the bush. If evil's going on, you expose it and you call it for what it is so that people can be brought to repentance, and that people who have been oppressed and they've been hurt can begin to find healing from the oppression that took place. Like there's no room for it in the church. But these church leaders have this really bad theology that says, well, we're all sinners and no sin is worse than the other. And, they treat what happened to you. They treat child rape. They treat all these horrific felony criminal offenses. They equate them with saying a cuss word. It's not the same. That's not
exactly right.
And so I think that's a big part of the problem. But theology aside, another big part of the problem is that we've allowed church leaders to hold all of the power in decision-making in our churches. This is a conversation. Oppression is a conversation that leaders shouldn't get to hold a monopoly on making decisions on.
Absolutely.
And so, we need to have survivors being the ones leading this conversation, leading the dialogue, and being the ones calling the shots in the churches. And I'm saying that as a church leader. we need to step aside and we need to say, you know what? If I've not been abused myself, I don't care if I'm the Pope himself. I don't get to call the shots on what happens next and how we handle allegations of abuse. I need to step aside and I need to let those who've been through it start calling those shots.
Absolutely. And I think I totally agree with what you're saying. And I've said it before, but, and I know I can only speak for myself, but as a survivor, I not only came forward to try and gain some closure for myself, but I want to help educate others. The fact that how to handle sexual abuse is still a question in the church is the problem in and of itself.
Yes.
The church should be the safest place for the vulnerable and the wounded. And the fact that this is so confusing to all sorts of religious leaders is where the problem lies, still. And we survivors, I know like I said, I can only speak for myself, but I am telling my story so that I can help educate others. I want people to learn from what I've experienced, from what I've gone through, how it's affected me personally, by hearing the truth about how the church acted or didn't act. These are all important things that we need to be listening to survivors.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
We wanted to ask to, while we're on that subject, what do you think a proper response should have been by Andy? And I'm talking back when you first, because you were one of the rare cases where a victim actually came forward and did disclose it, shortly after it happened. That's pretty rare. And the amount of courage that takes to be able to do that is incredibly, it's just incredibly brave. So it's not like, this happened years down the road. They had information at the time that this happened, right, from out of your mouth yourself. And so what would have a proper response have been by Andy, by Steve Bradley, by Larry Cotton? What would have been the proper response? How should have they handled that from your perspective?
And I think I'm really going to speak to Steve and Larry's response because I don't think that the perpetrator should have a say in what that response should look like.
That's right.
So, immediately, number one, they should have pulled him off the staff, which did not happen. He went on to teach True Love Waits. And it wasn't until I disclosed a little more information to some girls in my discipleship group that they truly pulled him off of ministry duty and whatnot. So I would say they should have immediately pulled him off the staff, immediately called the police. Law enforcement is trained to handle, number one, investigations, allegations of abuse. The church, pastors, church staff, they are not trained. They are not detectives. This is not something that the church can handle internally. And what's so mind-blowing to me is when and if you call the police, that takes all the pressure off of you.
Exactly.
As a pastor, you get to hand this off to someone else who is trained in how to deal with it. Why on earth would you not do that?
See,
because you're then making yourself liable for everything to come when you do not report it.
It's not just a liability. I mean, I agree with you 100%. And you're talking to two people who turned in, right. We turned in my dad I didn't even know it. I didn't know it at the time that we turned him in, that he was abusing victims in my church up to the time of his arrest. I didn't have a clue. And we still turned him in. And
right.
the thing that I was thinking is, I don't have a clue what to do with this. I wouldn't want to be the one in my church leading that charge.
Exactly.
The reason we went to the detective, who I was really good friends with, you were really good friends with her husband. We went to her because we didn't have a clue what we were doing. And that was, I mean, to be honest, if I'm going to be 100% honest, I didn't even know what mandated reporting laws were in Pennsylvania. I didn't go because I felt like I was a mandated reporter and I had to. I went because it was the right thing to do. There was never another option. You and I never had a conversation of should we report, should we not report. Both you and I, when we picked up the phone and talked to each other, we both said at the same time, we know exactly what we need to do.
And that's what's so disturbing, Jules, as I hear you talking. Put aside all the education and all of that, which we do need. Churches and everybody needs that education. But internally, we know. We know what the right thing to do.
I know in Texas, pastors are mandated reporters, and I believe that is not the law in every state. But this is about a moral obligation. You know, a minor has been sexually abused by a person in a position of power that's on staff at the church. Why would you even question what you should do? Absolutely report it to the police. The other thing I would say is that they should have offered help. I will tell you, when I went in and told Larry Cotton what happened, never after that did anyone come to me and speak to me regarding anything I said. Never once was I offered counseling. Never once was I offered any sort of support. Not once. No one came to me and offered anything, not even friendship.
I think that is such I don't know, it's the most horrible, shameful thing for any person to have to deal with when you live through that aloneness, when you have been betrayed. You were a minor, you went seeking help, and instead, basically, you were just told, keep your mouth shut. Just be quiet.
And that I was to blame.
And, you know, it's just shameful. It really is.
Absolutely. Another thing that I think should have been done is they should have been honest and transparent with everybody in that church, the entire congregation, about what had occurred. And I believe that in one of their statements, they said that they didn't say details because they were trying to protect me, which to me is a load of crud. They knew the rumors were going on. It was already out that Jules was the reason Andy Savage was leaving the church. The rumors were flying, you know, so what they could have done is protect me by coming forward and saying, we have had someone victimized sexually by one of our leaders. And the reason that's so important is because, again, it's not just about me. Was there other victims? Could there have been? Absolutely. I don't know if there were other victims, but there absolutely could have been. This is why everybody in the church needs to know what's going on. And they had that opportunity to say, you know, this has happened. We want everyone to know that it's not okay, that if for some reason anybody else has experienced something similar, we are here to support you. Please, you know, let us know, report it to the police yourself, whatever. I mean, it was a huge missed opportunity, and that was very damaging as well. And Oh yeah, we already talked about the other thing I was going to say, which was that they never, ever blame the victim. You know, the fact that I was asked if I participated, the fact that they said it would be harmful if I discussed this with other people. I mean, it's just, it goes back to it being a completely isolating situation. And like you said, Claire, the people, I went because, number one, Larry and Steve were over Andy in the church. Right. So I thought that was the right people to go to, and I trusted them. I mean, I was a 17-year-old girl.
Right. And you were a child seeking help is what it amounted
Absolutely.
to.
Absolutely.
Who was traumatized, wounded, seeking help. And those who had the ability to help did nothing to help you. When you said you went through all of that isolation, not one person reached out. To me, that is a loud statement. The silence is a very big statement that those church leaders made. And once again, it's the minimization of you as a person, and it's not acceptable. And to cast that light of shame on you, wrong, just so wrong.
Totally agree.
Well, I had I get cases just constantly. People that survivors reach out to me. I would say 100 survivors to one church leader. Church leaders are typically very silent. Not always. There are some who do reach out to me, and they genuinely want to know, what do we do? How do we handle this? To those who do it, I applaud them. I commend them. I had a church a couple weeks ago that was out west, and they handled a predator in their congregation of adult women exceptionally well. And I mean, this guy was immediately removed. There are letters going out to all churches and all denominations in a 3-county wide area, telling them exactly what this guy did, telling these churches that we advise you do not let this person in your church. They had a meeting with him. They gave him an opportunity to come clean, to repent, to make things right, to put things in place. And it likely would not have been at that church because he had victims at that church. It would have been elsewhere. But sure. They gave him every opportunity to do what was right, and the man didn't do it. And so they came out and did everything exactly right. So there are churches who are getting it right. They exist out there, but I still see the majority of churches getting it wrong. And so survivors, I think they really need to come together like never before and really rely on each other and realize that they have more power than they think they do. And, this victim blaming thing, I wanted to speak to that for a second because, man, people have to know how damaging that is for survivors. To ask what they were wearing, to ask what they did to bring it on, to ask even that question that you were asked, to what degree did you participate? Were you a participant? Those questions are devastating. And again, people know what's right and what's wrong, and Absolutely. They know what's like Absolutely. Common sense tells you that when you have a crying victim in front of you who's telling you the story, you don't start asking stupid questions like that.
Yeah.
Like
I totally agree. And it's funny, I've said before, in the Catholic religion, they go to confessional and they repent. Well, I was Southern Baptist, and we certainly did not have that. So it should have been very obvious from the get-go that I was not coming there to repent for anything I had done, but the only reason I was there is to report that I had been abused.
Yeah, I like that. I think we need to make a distinction between reporting and repenting. you know?
Absolutely.
And again, I mean, you don't have to go to seminary to figure that out. Like, this is common sense 101. Like, at the most basic level.
It should be common sense. And the fact that it is not with so many church leaders is very scary.
Yeah, it is. And it's like, this is not, I don't even think it's a Christian thing. I think as a human being, we know right from wrong. And we know that when somebody's crying out in front of us, an improper response is to start pointing the finger at somebody and saying, what did you do to bring this on? We don't do that with people in car accidents. We don't do that with people with sports accidents or with any other kind of physical accident. We don't have trauma doctors when people come in and they're helicoptered in to the hospitals. They don't open the back doors of the helicopter and say, my God, what did you do to bring this on? You know, like common sense 101 as a human, not even as a Christian. Basic humanitarian common sense says, when you know that a victim's in front of you of any sort,
sure,
you care for the wounds. And you triage the trauma, and you listen to the cries and the pleas of the person who's in pain. It's common sense.
Absolutely. We will see more caring. Thanks to people like you, Jules, we will see a lot more caring. We will see people alert, awake, responsible with when they are given the truth. I think we will see a lot more of that. However, we will also see an uncovering of a lot of cover-ups. And that part is, to me, that's very sad that has gone on. But it's part of the cleansing that I believe the church needs to go through. And Jimmy and I talk about it all of the time, that we're cleaning out. There's a house cleaning going on, and that needs to be done right now. The time is now. And thanks to brave women and brave men, such as you're doing and your friends that have been speaking out, this is happening. So again, thank you so much for what
thank you. You know, one of the things that I could never have predicted or could have ever predicted when I first decided to go public with my story is the amount of healing I would gain by just being able to be here for other people. I've since I shared my story publicly, I've spoken with countless numbers of survivors, and I have, been there to just listen. Sometimes people just need someone to listen to them.
Oh,
someone to, like you said, acknowledge what they have been through. And, but I could have never imagined the joy I would get out of this horrible situation, by now being, moving from victim to survivor and being able to help walk others through their story, whether they want to report it publicly, whether they want to report it to law enforcement, whether they just need to share it with someone other than themselves for the first time. Right. It has brought me so much healing, being able to help others. And that's been, like I said, an unexpected gain out of a horrible situation.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think many, many people need to hear that. Thank you again for all that you're doing and sharing with us.
I wanted to ask you, because, while we're kind of on that subject, because I get the great sense right now, and it's not just a sense, it's because I'm not that smart. People are actually telling me that they're fed up with structured, organized, cookie cutter religion, where we sink millions and millions and millions of dollars into a building that we use for 5 hours a week. while our missionaries are out in the mission field starving, holding their hands out. I have a sister, mom's next to youngest child. Her and her husband live in Haiti. And when they come home on what's supposed to be furlough, where they get rest, they're going around trying to raise money. So not only are they working in extreme environments, and it takes its toll on them emotionally and spiritually, but then they have to come home back to America and beg the richest nation in the world for money. And, Christians tend to be really tight-fisted when it comes to helping our missionaries who are actually out there in the mission field doing hard work. And we're open-fisted when it comes to pouring money into our lavish structures and programs that are in those structures. So, I'm hearing people, tons of survivors coming to me, telling me that, they can't bring themselves because of the abuse, because of the way that we just are all about image and building these fake facades. They can't walk inside of a church building. And so I think there's this growing number of survivors who are out there who are actively ministering to people exactly the way that you described. And I think that looks more like the New Testament church than any other church where we take pride in our great structures and our fantastic worship structure and our fantastic praise teams and all this stuff that we pride ourselves in. I think what you're doing just by listening to people looks much more like the New Testament church, where people were actually networked with each other. They actually cared for each other. They actually prayed with each other. They actually listened to each other. And they took action. When somebody's crying out for help, I don't get the sense that you're the kind of person that's like, yeah, we'll schedule an appointment when I get time, like for people,
Exactly. Sometimes I get phone calls at odd hours. I have 3 girls and there's kids screaming in the background, but I try my hardest to never put anyone on hold who needs help.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what would the ideal church in 2018 look like to you? If you were to just, if you could take a magic eraser and erase everything that you know, good and bad, about the way that we do church here in America, how would you describe the perfect church? Not the perfect church, but kind of the ideal church in 2018. Sure. What would that look like?
Well, as an abuse survivor and, turned advocate myself, the first thing that comes to my mind is regarding that topic, that the church would embrace all survivors. The statistics, there are statistics out there, that probably about 20% of your congregation are survivors of some kind of abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it was perpetrated within the church or without the church. There are so many different scenarios and stories that survivors have, but, specifically being, moving to the advocate world, I would love to see a church take abuse seriously, to be the first place, the first group, the first community to be loving, to listen, to empathize, and to really model who Jesus was,
Yeah, and I don't think it's really that complicated. I think, right. I don't know about you, and I've never asked you this question before, and I'm kind of curious, but I know my own experience. I realized how bad of a lens I was reading the Bible through prior to finding out that my dad was a serial pedophile. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we all have lenses and certain biases that we read the scripture through. As humans, I think we can't help that. We can try to be as objective as we can when we're reading scripture, but I didn't realize how badly I was reading into the Bible about all this stuff that I thought was just biblical fact,
Right.
I learned really quickly that this isn't anything what Jesus looks like. Like, I have a much more beautiful, clear picture of who Jesus was. And I find out how often Jesus was angry. And that's what I was talking to another survivor yesterday who said the same thing. And she said, I realized Jesus was angry a lot, and I love it because he was angry for the right reasons.
Absolutely. There, like you said, a lot of this is common sense, should be common sense. And the fact that the church is so obviously and very publicly now struggling with these issues, just speaks to the fact that we have got to make changes. Regarding abuse, there should be zero tolerance. There needs to be a lot of education, especially with, speaking of people on staff or leaders, pastors, a lot of, a lot of education needs to happen. There needs to be accountability. I was just talking with someone the other day, and we were talking about the fact that I used my name and my abuser's name and the pastor's names who covered up my abuse, that I said names. And I said, everybody's different, and I respect everybody, any victim, goes through a different process about processing how they want to handle their story. And I totally respect everybody's individual ideas, and what is best for them. For me, it was so important because it calls for accountability. These are not just isolated events popping up, and unless you name names, no one's going to be held accountable. And, I think that's where we start to see change is when we can hold people accountable and use that to move forward in a positive and productive way. Talking about,
by the way,
I
thank you.
Too. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so much, talking about, what the ideal church looks like. And you mentioning, we sink all this money into these huge glamorous buildings and there's a problem with celebrity pastors. And even I was in a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were saying that someone had told them that if a worship singer is, not quite the best singer, they don't want him up there. And that is just unbelievable. I said, the worship team is there to help lead worship, not be the worship. And, that is the same for the pastor. I want the church to get back to the root of why we're there, and to be a community filled with God's love. And when people start putting the image of the church, the image of the pastor, all of that stuff before anything else, it creates a very unsafe environment because it gives all the power to one person, and it becomes more about protecting their reputation and their image over truth.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I want to give a message to survivors who are kind of on the fence right now and who feel trapped, because again, I can't say it strongly enough that we have got to stop giving all this power to church leaders. And I'm saying that as a church leader myself. We've got to stop letting them control all the narrative. They decide whether the church is informed. This is the big one. They decide whether the church is informed if there's a registered sex offender in their church or not. The leaders decide. They're the ones in the know, quote unquote. They write that into their policies. Those who need to know will be in the know. Well, they need to stop being the ones who hold that power. They don't get to make those decisions. I'm sorry. That should not be a leadership decision. That should be a survivor decision. That should be
I totally agree. And when one person has all the power and the other people are left in the dark, do you know what that says to people who want to be perpetrators? Is that it's a safe place.
Absolutely.
They won't be held accountable, that not everyone knows what's going on. And it just creates this
open door invitation to the predators.
Absolutely. It's toxic.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what would you say? I want to close with this question and just ask what you would say to the survivors who are out there who just feel completely trapped. They've been isolated like you were. They've been abandoned like you were. They've been shut out by leaders like you were. They've just kind of been steamrolled and they're just tired, and they might be on the fence, kind of flirting with the idea that they want to do something to either expose their abusers or to just affect some kind of change within that church. What would your message be to those survivors who are just struggling with that right now?
Sure. Well, I think, the first and foremost thing I want to tell other survivors is I believe you and that you are not alone. Sorry, I'm getting emotional.
No, you're absolutely fine.
It is so isolating, and it's amazing. I just finished reading excuse me, Krista Brown's book, This Little Light. I highly recommend it for any survivor or advocate. But she was speaking out against this stuff in 2006 through 2009, and has continued to speak out. I thought I was all alone until December, January of this year. I thought I was the only one who had experienced something like this. And so, as sad as that is, first thing I want to get across is that you are not alone. And I believe you. I believe you. And I've since going public with my story, at first I stayed off of social media and whatnot, but I have since, I have a public profile on Twitter. I want to be accessible to everyone, especially other victims. And so I just invite anyone, if they need someone to talk to, someone to just listen, someone to, bounce ideas off of, maybe get advice. I have put myself out there, and like I said, it brings me so much joy when I can just hold somebody else's hand, just like I had Dee and Amy, Kenny, Brooks, and Michael hold my hand as I told my story. That now, I'm swapping positions and I can be there to hold somebody else's hand. And so reach out. You're not alone. I believe you. And there is an amazing, advocacy support survivor groups that are making themselves accessible, whether it's me, whether it's somebody else. I want them to know that they're not alone. I think everybody is going to choose what's best for them. Some people don't want to go public. Some people do. Some people, if they go public, don't want to use names. Some people do, and I respect everybody's choice. That's definitely an individual choice. I would never want to pressure anybody into doing anything that made them feel uncomfortable. In any way. I just really want to be here to support them. It is their story, just like my story was my story. I got to tell it the way I wanted, and I respect that of every other survivor out there.
Awesome. Well, we can't thank you enough. And we always end each podcast with a truth bomb. So our truth bomb this time is for people just to tell the truth. The truth always leads to the next best step. And I'm encouraged by the networking of survivors that I'm seeing. I think exactly what you described is just taken off like crazy. And survivors who felt so alone for so long are leaning on each other. And I think that's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And I'm encouraged by that. And I'm encouraged by you.
As I am too, Jules. It's wonderful hearing you talk and to hear you say that you feel like you're on the path to healing. That's powerful. That's wonderful.
Well, thank you guys. And thank you so much for speaking out and for doing all that you have done and continue to do. You guys are heroes in my book, and I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to come share some thoughts with you guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and thank you to our listeners for listening to this episode, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.